The letter arrived in Gary Combs's mailbox on a Tuesday in April. The envelope was thick and white. The return address was Ridgeline Mineral Holdings, LLC, with an address in Lexington. Gary read it at the kitchen table, 6 pages. It informed him that Ridgeline had acquired, through a series of portfolio transfers, the mineral rights to his 91-acre parcel in Breathitt County, Kentucky, identified as Combs Family Property, Deed Book 14, page 388. The original deed, executed and recorded in October of 1931, granted full mineral rights, coal, gas, oil, and all subsurface resources, to the predecessor company, Eastern Kentucky Mineral Syndicate. Ridgeline, as the current holder, intended to exercise them. An exploratory drilling assessment was scheduled to begin within 90 days. The letter asked Gary to contact their representative to discuss access arrangements. He set it down. He read the relevant line again. Mineral rights. 91 acres. His 91 acres. His grandfather, Ezra Combs, had cleared that land himself. His father had worked it after Ezra. Gary had worked it after his father. 3 generations on 91 acres, and somewhere in 1931, before Gary's father was born, a deed had been recorded that gave the coal underneath all of it to a company that no longer existed, whose rights had passed through how many hands Gary didn't know, and had arrived in a thick envelope on a Tuesday morning like a bill for something that had already been taken. He set the letter down a second time. He called his daughter and asked her to come. Ezra Combs was born in 1894 in Breathitt County, the son of a man who worked the timber camps on the North Fork of the Kentucky River for $1.10 a day and never owned anything. Ezra watched that his whole childhood. He understood early that ownership was the only kind of security that could not be revoked at a foreman's discretion, and he set about acquiring it with a patience that did not look like ambition from the outside, but functioned like it. He spent 14 years working the coal camps and timber crews of eastern Kentucky, saving against every instinct those jobs created to spend what you had while you had it. He began buying land in 1921, 12 acres first along a creek hollow for $190, then 8 more from a neighbor leaving for Ohio factory work, then 22 from an estate auction in 1926. 7 separate transactions across 10 years, all paid in cash, none of them easy, until by 1931 he had assembled 91 acres from what had been other men's discarded or abandoned ground. He cleared it himself. He built the farmhouse in 1924 from timber cut on his own ridge. He married Beulah Day in 1922. She was 18, the daughter of a schoolteacher in Jackson, precise and unhurried and constitutionally skeptical of verbal agreements. She had brought that skepticism to the marriage and deployed it quietly for 72 years. Beulah kept everything. That is the kind of woman she was. Every transaction, every letter received, every agreement made. She wrote it down or saved the original. Her filing system was a hat box, a round pasteboard box with a pale blue lid that had come with a hat she bought for a cousin's wedding in 1927. She kept it on the top shelf of the bedroom closet for 67 years. When she died in 1994 at 90, it was still there. Gary's father Leonard had inherited the farm in 1961 when Ezra died and had worked it for 34 years until his own health turned. Gary had taken over in 1995 at 41. He was the 3rd man to farm that particular 91 acres, and he had known the land the way you know something you grew up inside. Not as a holding, but as a condition of life, as obvious and unremarkable as weather. He was 70 years old when the letter arrived. He had farmed the land for 29 years on his own and had worked it alongside Leonard for 14 years before that. He had never heard the name Eastern Kentucky Mineral Syndicate. He had also never opened the hat box. Ridgeline Mineral Holdings had been formed in 2019 as a subsidiary of an investment group called Appalachian Resource Partners, based in Lexington. Its stated purpose was acquiring dormant mineral rights portfolios in eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, and southern Ohio, rights that had been conveyed through broad-form deeds in the early 20th century, left unexercised for decades, and were now of significant value given changes in extraction technology. The firm had completed 14 portfolio acquisitions in 5 years, covering mineral rights on more than 40,000 acres across 6 counties. The representative who came to Gary's door 3 weeks after the letter was named Brett Saylor. He arrived in a black SUV. He was 36 years old. He wore a collared shirt and carried a folder, and was polite in the way people are polite when the outcome has already been decided and the conversation is a formality. He sat at Gary's kitchen table and explained that the 1931 deed was a standard broad-form mineral conveyance, common practice across eastern Kentucky in that era. He said the deed had been recorded continuously since 1931. He said Ridgeline held clear title to the subsurface rights and was prepared to discuss reasonable surface accommodation arrangements. Gary asked what the coal was worth. Brett Saylor said he wasn't able to discuss that at this stage. Gary said, "What did they pay my grandfather for it in 1931? Brett Saylor checked his folder. He said the original consideration recorded in the deed was $18. Gary looked at him for a moment. Brett Saylor said the value of mineral rights had changed considerably since 1931, and that Ridgeline was prepared to offer a fair surface accommodation payment. He left 40 minutes later without a signed agreement. He left a card on the table. A follow-up letter arrived 8 days later. The exploration equipment was scheduled for 67 days out. Gary brought the hatbox down from the closet the evening after Brett Saylor's visit. He had to stand on a step stool to reach it. The pale blue lid was filmed with dust along its edges. He carried it to the kitchen table. His daughter Marie sat across from him. She had driven up from Boonville that afternoon. She watched him set the hatbox down and look at it for a moment before he lifted the lid. The papers inside were stacked in an order that had made sense to Beulah and had since settled into something only she could have read. Letters, folded. A small spiral notebook. Receipts from the 1940s and 1950s. A photograph of Ezra and Beulah in front of the farmhouse. Gary estimated the early 1930s from how young they looked. Beulah in a dark dress, Ezra holding his hat. 2 envelopes addressed in Beulah's handwriting to a law office in Hazard. Both unpostmarked. Never sent. He unfolded the first. It was a letter Beulah had written in March of 1963 to an attorney named Horace Keller in Hazard. Her handwriting was small and careful. She described a transaction from October of 1931. A man had come to the farm representing a company called Eastern Kentucky Mineral Syndicate. He had told Ezra the document was a right-of-way agreement, that the company needed permission to run survey lines across the upper ridge as part of a regional mapping project. He had said the $18 was compensation for the inconvenience of the crew crossing the property. Ezra's reading had always been limited. The man had not read the document to him. Beulah had been in the kitchen and had not seen the signing. She had written, "I did not learn what he had truly signed until 1938, when another man came asking about mining on the ridge. By then, the first man was gone, and the company had closed its local office. I have been told there is nothing to be done. I do not believe that." Gary set the letter down. He opened the second envelope. It was a carbon copy of an internal company letter dated March of 1934 on Eastern Kentucky Mineral Syndicate letterhead. It was addressed from the company's Hazard field office to the main office in Lexington. In the body, the 1931 transaction with Ezra Combs was referenced as the Combs Surface Survey Agreement, Breathitt County, executed October 1931. Not a mineral deed, not a mineral conveyance, a surface survey agreement. The company's own internal records, 3 years after the signing, called it a survey agreement. Gary did not speak for a long time. Marie said, "Dad." He said, "She kept this for 60 years. Marie looked at the carbon copy. She said, "Where did she get it?" Gary said he didn't know. He had no way of knowing. He never would. Beulah had kept it the way she kept everything, because it existed and throwing it away had never felt right, and she had died without knowing if it would ever matter. The attorney was named Carol Ann Bevins, out of an office in Hazard. She had practiced mineral and property law in eastern Kentucky for 23 years. Gary called her 2 days after opening the hatbox. She listened to the account without interrupting. She said she needed to see the documents in person. She was careful at first. She said broad-form mineral deeds from the 1930s had a long and complicated legal history in Kentucky. She said courts had generally upheld them. She said Ridgeline's recorded title was a strong starting position. Then she read Beulah's letter. Then she read the 1934 carbon copy. She was quiet for 9 minutes. She said, "Their own field office called it a survey agreement 3 years after the signing. If Ezra had signed a mineral deed and everyone at the company understood that, no one in 1934 would have called it a surface survey agreement. They called it that because that is what their agent told him he was signing." She filed in Breathitt Circuit Court within 10 days, challenging the deed on the grounds of fraud in the inducement. The filing attached Beulah's 1963 letter as Exhibit A and the 1934 carbon copy as Exhibit B. Ridgeline's legal team was a firm in Lexington that had litigated mineral rights cases across eastern Kentucky for 14 years. Their lead attorney, Philip Crane, was 44 years old. He filed a response arguing that Beulah's letter was hearsay, that the carbon copy's language was ambiguous, and that 90 years of uncontested recording gave Ridgeline clear title regardless of the circumstances of execution. The hearing was in the Breathitt County Courthouse in Jackson, second floor. A small courtroom with high windows and wood paneling on the lower walls and the Kentucky state seal behind the bench. The air conditioning had been running longer than it needed to. Judge Meredith Hale had served on the circuit bench for 17 years. She had read both filings the night before. Philip Crane spoke for 23 minutes. He argued that the phrase surface survey agreement in the 1934 internal letter referred to the surface access component of a mineral conveyance, not to the nature of the deed itself. He said the characterization was imprecise internal shorthand, and that the recorded deed's plain language controlled. He had a chart. He used the chart. Carol Ann Bevins responded in 3 sentences. She said, "The 1931 deed is titled Full Mineral Conveyance and Grant. If Eastern Kentucky Mineral Syndicate's own field office understood it as such in 1934, they would not have called it a survey agreement. They called it a survey agreement because that is what their agent told Ezra Combs he was signing, and the 1934 letter is the company's own contemporaneous evidence of that misrepresentation." She placed the carbon copy on the bench. Judge Hale read it. She set it down and picked up the 1931 deed. She read that. She looked at Philip Crane. She said, "Counsel, can you show me where in the 1931 deed the surface survey rights are separately described? The rights your client says the 1934 letter was referencing?" Philip Crane consulted his materials for a moment that stretched past comfortable. He said, "The deed is a unified instrument. The survey reference in the 1934 letter would have been—" Judge Hale said, "I'm asking about the deed language specifically. Show me the surface survey provision." He could not show her the language because the language was not in the deed. She ruled for Gary Combs 3 weeks later in a written opinion of 19 pages. She found that the 1934 internal document constituted contemporaneous evidence by the deed holder's own predecessor that the 1931 transaction had been misrepresented at signing, sufficient to support a finding of fraud in the inducement. She voided the deed. She assessed legal costs of $28,400 against Ridgeline. The exploration equipment never arrived. Ezra and Beulah were buried at the top of the East Field, under 2 stones Gary's father had set in 1961 and 1994. The plot was fenced with cedar posts Ezra had cut from his own ridge, replaced twice since then, but always cedar, always from the same stand. Gary walked up there on a Sunday afternoon, 4 days after the ruling came in the mail. The field was running well. The hay was thick on the lower ground, and the creek was clear, and the ridge timber stood the way it had stood since before he was born. He went through the gate and up the slope. He stood in front of Beulah's stone for a while. Name, years, nothing written below them, the way she would have wanted it. He said, "I open the box." He stood there until the shadow of the ridge line reached the fence post. Then he walked back down. Beulah wrote the letter in 1963 and never sent it. Gary didn't know why. Maybe she had been told it was too late. Maybe she had decided to wait for something she didn't know she was waiting for. What he knew was that she had kept it and the carbon copy both, for 31 years after she wrote the letter, for 60 years after the man had come to the farm, and that she had died without knowing if it would matter, and it had mattered entirely. Gary Combs was not the only landowner in Breathitt County to receive a Ridgeline letter that spring. There were 6 others, same letterhead, same 90-day notice, same $18 cited as original consideration. What those families found when they started looking is the next story, and one of them found something that stopped Ridgeline's entire eastern Kentucky operation.
Subscribe so you don't miss it.
We'll see you there.